Disclaimer, I played Sifu on the Xbox Series X and will talk about it in the context of me doing so. Any performance or glitch type issue may differ for others. I will try and indicate when I talk spoilers, but beware that footage may be considered spoiler heavy. I also streamed my gameplay of Sifu on this channel, so if you'd like to watch the whole thing, check the VOD playlist in the description. As usual, another review, this time of a smaller but still great game that personally I loved for many reasons. First thing I'll say is I think personally it's criminal how few martial arts or like kung fu type of games we have. Sleeping Dogs was personally one of my favorite games that I played during the early Xbox One PS4 generation with the definitive edition. I was really having that itch to really kind of jump back into something that is like it in terms of its vibe, more or less. So I finally decided to boot up Sifu. As a fan also of harder, more challenging difficulty type games, I was also interested in it because it does have that drive for you to get better at the game using a multitude of mechanics we'll talk about in this review of the game. Just to be transparent, I beat the game both endings on Disciple, which is I think the middle difficulty, and was that kind of intended experience before Master came out. I also didn't engage with the arena's expansion. I think I said in a community post I don't really think it personally appealed to me, and I just kind of wanted to move on and not drag out the game to kind of have a negative twist on it. Maybe at some point I'll try it if people want me to. Leave a comment and I'll consider it. Anyway, without further deliberation, let's get into the review proper. So Sifu has this nice art and graphical style that I think was used very well throughout the game. It kind of reminds me of Into the Spider-Verse, of course not being the only time it's used, but it's very angular and stylized, which I appreciate. I do think these types of stylized art styles and graphics are really good for smaller developers to develop that distinct aesthetic and distinct identity for their games. I mean, if everyone is trying to go for a really realistic, graphical, intensive art style, both on the indie, AA and AAA alike front, I do think that we will tend to get more samey looking games at the end of the day. Indie games especially just have less resources to really play around with, so I think it's a good playground for experimentation to make people remember the game as something more unique. What also really helps is not only the art style and graphical style working well, that they also have an all-around shine and quality on a game that I think really will allow it to perhaps outlast some of the games that look good on the surface but have some issues graphically which drop them down in quality. Now onto the aesthetic of the game. I felt like it had a good consistent aesthetic across its levels. It didn't feel like it broke the style it was going for, which can happen and will ruin a game. What I mean by having like an inconsistent aesthetic is different types of locations throughout the game that didn't feel like to me that they were just kind of mashups and unnatural to the setting. Again, there are some crazy combinations and places throughout the game, and I think it can kind of be jarring to some people, but for me it kind of had a different feeling when in the game we started to step into the more abstract and sensationalized locations. This kind of mix between traditional kung fu movie or perhaps Chinese architecture in general with a more modern, contemporary, urban aesthetic gave it that distinct feeling without getting too deep into the levels right now. So I really like the setup, opening and story in general in Sifu. It's definitely a story that takes a lot from that made some of the great kung fu movies special, with themes of revenge, discipline, structured in a gauntlet type of manner, taking down each one of the enemies who are involved in your character's father's murder, which takes place right in front of you at the hands of Yang. Years later you are prepared and ready to go and seek what you've been training for. This is a story that of course has been told many times across many different mediums, across different cultures. When it comes to how Sifu in particular deals with it, I really like the idea they went for in terms of you having two different endings. Naturally you're going to get the bad ending at first because everything in the game points you towards it. Kill all the bosses and then finally kill Yang in the name of vengeance for what he did to your father. But it's only after looking deeper into the story that you can really feel, you can kind of appreciate how they've used gaming to not only adapt this format of a story but also to allow it to move forward. In a movie format, for example, you wouldn't have been really able to do the second ending like Sifu does. You go through once, defeat the bosses, and then that's that. But in Sifu, once you learn the truth and you see the bad ending, it does make you want to go through the game again and get the true ending. Spoiler alert now, if you spare all the bosses including Yang, you get the ending. Now there is some deeper lore stuff in Sifu which I don't think I fully unlocked for that, but I could kind of see what was going on generally. Yang I thought was a good antagonist, that kind of standard story with the student who kills his master, you as a second student, son or daughter, being then the one to avenge your father. In this case you can kind of see where Yang is coming from though, whether morally or emotionally you're on the side of the father or him. I think it's a good quandary to present to the player on some level. While I did enjoy the story of the game, it's not really, again, a main reason for me to really recommend it. If the story was bad here and everything else was left the same in Sifu, it wouldn't be too much of a large loss or knockdown in how I see the game, but that's just personally how I felt. Now here's the actual big reason I would recommend Sifu. I think Sifu has some of the best combat in terms of feeling and fairness that I've played in a while. What do I mean by that, you might add? So I'll give an example. I think Dark Souls 1 and 3 are very fair, challenging games. What does that mean? It means the enemies are constrained by the same game limitations as the player. We're both bound by tools that the game has laid out for us. What I mean is, if I mess up, it's close to if an enemy goes ahead and messes up. It's not like if an enemy messes up, they can do some physics breaking, weird, unfair combo that just punishes the player for no reason. For me, I found Sifu to be very similar in this aspect. If you take the time to learn and the discipline to get better at the game, understand the tools, movesets available to you, I just can't see how you would not enjoy the game. The game does a lot to incentivize playing better, which I think I'll say for the progression section, but is so good to feel like the game is giving you reasons to learn its style more than just, I can't beat the boss. At some points, you can just not be able to win if you died enough. More on what the combat system entails you as a disciple or student martial artist, of course, primarily will use Kung Fu and a few other traditional Chinese styles of martial arts. You have heavy and light attacks which incorporate subtly in a few, depending on which combos you use or really focus on. There's a lot to learn from just the base of the combat, including throws, grabs, sweeps, and other basic mechanics. Then of course you need to think about defense, which I think was a really good and probably one of the most satisfying things in the game, perhaps more than the offense itself. You can of course just block or deflect, which is good, but you won't really get that far, to be honest, as it's not a be-all end-all type of block. Enemies will attack you in a certain point, like aiming for your head or sweep, allowing them to kill you extremely easily if you're not careful. Dodging is another basic aspect of defense, but it's something for me that was something I had to kind of unlearn, or at least use it sparingly, because I just thought the other two tools coming up were just superior. Those tools were both parries and avoids, both utilizing the block, in this case deflect style of gameplay, but really going to the next level. Parries are kind of a standard again in these types of more difficult combat games, as it's more involved and it adds that layer of complexity onto combat. Parry here I felt was more learnable and kind of a natural thing that you did, and it wasn't something you had to specifically learn how to do, like it being on a separate button. Essentially it is tied to deflect or block. It's just about timing, which for some people can be an annoyance. Then there's the top tier unique thing that I really fell in love with in the combat as soon as I learned it, was the avoid system or the avoid mechanic. As somebody pointed out to me in chat, it's something that is more advanced, but once you learn it and kind of get into the habit of doing it in the game, it just adds a whole new layer of possibilities in combat. Now I'm really going with this system, but I was really surprised by it during the course of the game after I properly learned about it. So again, a mechanic focused on block and deflect, essentially how people described avoid to me, and the best way to describe it was Ultra Instinct from Dragon Ball Super. You essentially have to hold block and just stand there, and then with the left stick you can choose to avoid in different directions, specifically with a boss or certain enemies fight pattern. You can learn what enemies usually requires which avoid rhythm, you could call it. This especially worked well I think with bosses, and for one-on-one fights it's always really tricky when you have to fight more than one in general. I feel to trigger or be more mindful of your defensive capabilities, as you're essentially always looking over your shoulder, making sure an enemy is not going to corner you. A big aspect of combat is of course the different pickups and objects you can use to improvise in the fight. Things that only act as throwables do exist, like bottles and bricks, which I believe you can't use in combat properly, but there is also bats, machetes, bow staffs, etc. These do act as weapons that you can pick up, and they all have their own nuances and use cases. For example, the secret one-shot kill attack that all blade weapons have. Hold down heavy until you move the blade up and then let go, and the bladed weapon will be used as a one-shot attack on a basic enemy. Be aware that you will not get your weapon back though after this though. It will be stuck on your enemy. Bats are pretty useful for stunning your enemies. A lot of the times you could get an enemy stumbling back when you hit them with a bat. Of course you can throw your weapon, and depending on its durability it can be usable afterwards, or it could just instantly break. Final thing I do want to talk about is the general standout, without talking about Sifu's progression systems, is focus. This essentially acts as that special attack in a way you might see in other games. You build up focus from combat, you then use it depending on a few things like focus points you've unlocked from the permanent progression tree, and you can actually use a specific ability that might also require a specific weapon, such as the thigh cut requiring a bladed weapon to use. Focus throughout the game was useful in controlling the battlefield, I feel. When I said earlier that these are abilities you essentially save up for, they aren't some grand big attack, they're more stun based. Take this specific enemy out of the fight for a while, making him stop blocking for a bit. Now that's essentially the basics of the combat from a decent scale. There's a lot more to talk about the combat that's more tied to progression. So far we've talked about how the combat, I feel, is some of the most fair in terms of challenging you to a point where you can easily die, but it was your fault ultimately. You and the enemies act on a level playing field. Now an aspect I think can be divisive for people is some of the progression, especially to do with the age mechanic. I think this simulates an interesting feeling that I don't think another challenging game has really given me before, and I have to really hand it to the devs when it comes to this. So essentially Sifu on its own isn't a long game at all. In fact, if you're good enough, you can complete it in around 2 hours, to be honest, as there are 5 levels throughout the game. But the way the game uses the age mechanic to prioritize you not just beating the level once, but you trying to beat it at the lowest possible age to carry over to the next level, that kind of creates this incentive and a reward for the player that doesn't exist in a lot of other games. For example, in another challenging game, let's say for argument's sake, Dark Souls again, there's that relief after defeating a boss, that victory symbolizing you defeating that boss, and you won't have to, for the rest of that playthrough, go through and do that boss again. But in Sifu, you defeating a boss isn't really what's important. Defeating the boss with the lowest amount of deaths possible for you, and the only way you're really going to do that is by beating the boss again and again, actually learning and mastering the mechanics of the game, the boss's general requirements. Say again, in a game where you only need to defeat the boss once, you can kind of get lucky and get away with at some points not knowing what the boss requires of you. For example, beating a difficult boss on your first try, but if you were to go through that boss again, you would take another 50 tries to beat him. So how does the actual aging mechanic work? Now I've talked about why I like it a lot. So you start at the age of 20 at the beginning of the game. Every time you die, your age goes up depending on how much your death counter is. Let's say you go to the first level, death counter is 0, then you die, death counter increases by 1, and so then does your age to 21. But let's say you die again quickly after, your age counter will increase to 2, your age would increase by 2, so you would be 23 instead of 22, if that makes sense. There are certain ways to decrease your death counter, like defeating an enemy who has been upgraded or gone Super Saiyan, as I like to call them, when they have this yellow aura around them, or their health bar has the same yellow glow to it. Along with some other enemies in general, the more you die, the more your death counter increases, and the more you're ultimately going to age. Death counter, by the way, doesn't reset across levels, and neither does your age. So let's say I get to level 3 and I'm the age of 47. Let's say I died specifically to the second boss a lot and my death counter is 6 after defeating that boss. I'd still have that death counter. If I remember, it might go down to 5. In general, that doesn't matter. The point is, it sticks with you. Age isn't just an aesthetic thing. First, if you get over the age of 70 and die, the game is over. But more tangibly, in gameplay, your health will be decreased, but the damage you will do also increases. Rewards at the Jade statue will also be unobtainable at certain ages, including certain skills with XP. A nice thing though is if you clear a level at a lower age and you want to start from that level again. So for me, I cleared the second level at 21, so I can always go and start the third from 21 if I want to start my run from the third level. However, it will save your rewards up to that point you got. So let's say I went to the Jade statue and I didn't redeem anything, but that ended up being my lowest age run. That stuff I missed from the Jade statue would apply if I started from that point onwards, if that makes sense. Speaking about the Jade statue and the skill tree, I do want to talk about them a bit more, as they are a meaningful progression system. The Jade statue being specifically for that run, and the skill tree being a way you can spend XP and get some abilities or moves for the run, but isn't permanent at first either, unless you put more XP into that specific ability. And the abilities aren't super crazy impactful either. Like I said, it's not something we go ahead and then the levels that are hard become instantly easy. At most, the game just gives you more tools to play around with and learn just from the base offerings. I like the idea of having to put 5 points to actually permanently unlock a skill, because it does have that feeling of discipline, dedication and mastery to it in a small sense, if that makes any sense, which are all three very core themes to the style and genre. I don't know if I've seen translated into gameplay in the same way. The skill doesn't actually permanently get stronger, by the way, with each point unlocked. The Jade statue, as I said, is just a way for you in the individual run to get some upgrades. Now for me, these upgrades were pretty self-explanatory to get. I focused on the ones in earlier levels that are based on age, as I felt those were the most universally good ones that weren't situational and the most likely to lose, as it just required dying. Then there's the other two ways to spend your points in a Jade statue that's with score or XP, which I focused on once all the age-based upgrades were acquired, which should happen by the 3rd level if you get every Jade statue. Now personally, I like stuff where the score is implemented in games. It's a nice way to prioritize getting better. You want the number to go up, get good, number goes up. It fits in nicely to action combat games that want you to get better at combos, not getting interrupted, fast paced, etc. You get the point. The point in me talking about all these progression systems, whether permanent or not, is that it kind of all wraps around the idea of Sifu fundamentally. You must become more disciplined, you must repeat bosses and levels as to then master them, for that's how you have the best chance of beating the game. So in terms of the enemies, there are different archetypes, I would say, to the different enemies that get introduced throughout at least half of the levels of the game. I would say by level 4 you've basically seen all the enemy types the game has to offer. They can essentially be broken down into the following: the basic enemies, henchmen, which are pretty easy to deal with. You just have to look out for them having a weapon because they can mess you up, especially in groups if you try to not take them seriously. Then I would say you have the juggernauts, which are these fat kind of brute type enemies. You can see definitely the slowest, but do not underestimate the damage they can do and follow up with. Their most notable thing they do is the grab, which can take you out if you're hit with the follow-up punches. Then there are the flash kicks, which I think were the most tricky to deal with in terms of archetypes. They're good at dodging, and if you can hit them they're easy to deal with, but they can really mess you up with fast follow-up combos with a lot of sweeps involved. There are a few more distinct enemy types, but I would say the last kind of really distinct archetype would be the bodyguards, introduced in the 3rd level. These guys are kind of a more dangerous version of the juggernaut for me, at least. They have the power and the speed. They grab essentially acting as a grapple. They can get a few punches in on you. These guys you really need to be careful for, I feel. Now in terms of bosses, I think they were all pretty good and fun to learn what does and what doesn't work with them. I could see a world where the bosses are designed not to be learned and are really bad, but this is the payoff of good boss design. You can actually learn the patterns and you can kind of know what you can get away with in a lot of circumstances. Like for example, Sean, who was my favourite boss, I felt he was maybe the 2nd or 3rd hardest, but I enjoyed going from not knowing how to get anything past him to literally being able to stand there and avoid every single attack, picking him off slowly or quickly and dictating the pace of the fight. Now the first boss can give you some trouble with him having a knife, but I think he's okay in terms of you can just get past him. He acts as a good way to learn when to dodge, avoid, parry, etc. I would say for me personally the 3rd boss was the hardest. Purely from the 1st phase, I felt the 2nd phase was much easier. The 3rd boss I feel requires a lot of patience, and you can never really be the one to dictate the pace entirely here, which can be conflicting to the other bosses. I feel the 2nd phase really does give you the ability to dictate the pace of the fight more, which is good. The last boss I think was my 2nd favorite and the 2nd hardest. Not to spoil it too much, it's really good at just testing how much did you actually master the mechanic the game presents to you, or did you just over rely on some stuff. It acts as that final test to see how you really did. The mechanic of sparing the bosses I thought was the best in terms of me allowing myself to get better, because it really forces you to not only pay attention, because you have to allow the bosses to fight a little bit more, not too much more, but essentially the fight is generally longer, but also the boss's health becomes a big thing, because if you try to spare them and in the process they run out of health, you insta-kill them and that ruins the whole level when you have to do it again. This is the issue with sparing the first boss, as he doesn't have too much health. Easily rely on spamming heavy attacks for him to be spared, so what you have to do is really focus on light attacks and parrying, and mastering those becomes essential in damaging structure but not damaging health to a high degree. Now the last little section before we finish up this review, the general levels, secrets, and then finally modifiers. Found the levels themselves to be well designed in terms of feeling unique in the spectacle they provide. They're kind of broken up into 2 or 3 distinct feels, if that makes sense. For example, level 4, you start out in the office building, very clean, modern type of aesthetic to it, with gold everywhere and whatnot, but then halfway through the level you do go into more of like a cave-like section under the tower, from what I can see, because you fall through the elevator. Similarly to the museum, I felt it had this masterful design in terms of how you go from this very modern contemporary art to this more abstract, colourful, and overall interesting otherworldly area where the statues start to come to life and attack you. The club does something similar as well, with the nightclub area to a burning temple of the trials. The spectacle and presentation really being there. Now there are some secret things to go ahead and find in these levels. I don't think I found all of them, but they were mostly lore and shortcuts. Weirdly, I found an extra upgrade in the skill tree being unlocked from one of these secrets. It was in general nice to see lore bits, especially the ones that take place over multiple levels. For example, you find something in level 5 that then unlocks something from level 1, which you have to go back and open, which adds some context to the story. Now lastly, I didn't focus on them at all, but after you beat the story once, you unlock modifiers, and I thought this was an interesting way from my little look through them. It seems you spend these points you accumulate from different goals and challenges to then make the levels harder for yourself in interesting ways, like making yourself have 1 health point, stronger enemies, no guarding, etc. That kind of adds a lot of replayability to the game more than already existed. There are also modifiers, if I remember correctly, that actually make the game easier, but I don't think that saves your progress or score. Now, to finish up this review of Sifu, as usual, would I recommend Sifu to someone generally? I just can't recommend it to just anyone as a must-play game, but because it is doing something different than maybe expected. The game is decently difficult, so for those looking for a narrative, easier experience with this and just really doesn't want to engage too much with the different reward systems that the game provides and incentivizes to get better, if you're someone like that, Sifu might just not be for you. However, if you're on the fence, you don't really know what to expect from the game, and you go in with a mindset of trial and error, wanting to learn the game and get better and better, I feel like you could have a good experience of this. Just trying it out, as it is on Game Pass. I'm not sure if it's on PS Plus. However, you're someone who values that challenge and kind of mastery and gameplay off the bat as the core experience to enjoy it. I feel more comfortable saying that you have to go ahead and give Sifu a try. It's actually one of the best feelings to go ahead and master a boss, more than just passing a boss, if that makes sense. In terms of runtime, Sifu can usually vary in general, but I spent about 20 hours going through the whole game, experiencing it and completing it twice for both endings. I could have spent a lot more time here, I feel, especially with the arena mode, or if I wanted to play around with modifiers. There's a lot of replayability here, which is good. Now, since Sifu is not part of a series of games, and I'm not sure it will be, I will refrain from giving it a definitive score, so we'll go to pros and cons. Pros: doesn't overstay its welcome. Masterful combat feeling. Masterfully combines systems to emulate discipline in the game. Excellent boss design. Great and replayable level design. Interesting lore and story. Cons: learning curve can need some adapting to. Camera can be an issue at certain fights. Enemy archetypes can get a bit stale because you're fighting them a lot. Some shortcuts can be more of a decision based on your Jade statue upgrades. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please go ahead and like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and I hope to see you guys next time. Bye.